Hi, I'm David Hurl, and in this session, I'm going to just take you through the logical framework. We also have a short video on the logical framework, which you might also like to watch. So let's just think a little bit about the word logic, and it has many definitions. We could say logic is around how things are expected to work. The relationship between elements and between an element and the whole, a way of making sense of complex phenomena, a set of beliefs about what we expect to happen in the future based on context and knowledge about cause and effect or hypothesis about how things will unfold. So the idea of the logical framework at its core is the idea of a logic. And a logic model is a series of if-then statements. So what we're trying to create with a logical framework is that if-then relationship. So if certain resources are needed to run your program or project, if you then have access to them, then you can accomplish your activities. If you can accomplish these activities, then you will have delivered the services you planned. And if you have delivered the services as planned, then there will be benefits for clients, communities, systems, or organizations. So as we can see here, we move upwards from resources, which is our inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, trying to build an if-then type of relationship. We organize our logic model and our logical framework according to a hierarchy of results. There are some differences in the words we use, and different organizations, slight variance in that. Basically, this at the lowest level is the inputs, and that's pretty well defined by everybody. These are the resources needed to undertake activities. We then move to activities. These are the activities done by the action or by the project or program, so the actual things you do. The output is the product of those action activities. So these are the direct result of the activity you do, and that is the output. If we do that output, then the next level in upward is the outcome. And this is the changes in behavior or improvements as a result of the outputs being accomplished. At the highest level, we have the impact, and these are the improvements in society or well-being of people. Sometimes in some logical frameworks, they use the word goal at the impact level, and at the outcome level, some people use the term purpose. So there is a little bit of change in wording. And there are other variants of the words, but the principle remains the same. So the logical framework is a matrix that is used to present information about these project objectives, outputs, and activities in a systematic and logical way. And it consists of 16 cells organized into 4 columns and 4 rows, as indicated in the slide I'm about to show you. It looks like this. Again, some slight variation of the matrix, but basically the logical framework looks like that. As I said, sometimes on the left-hand side, some people change the wording slightly. Sometimes people use the term results as the output, result one. Sometimes people use the term purpose for outcome, and impact sometimes referred to as goal. So you have to use what suits you in your particular project or program. The logical frameworks, in fact, was an old tool that was developed by the American Space Agency and then became used by the American aid program USAID. And then it sort of has gained universal acceptance really across the whole development community. And still to this day is very much seen as a fundamental planning tool. For those of us working in M&E, the logical framework is a fundamental tool. It is something we need to have for every project. By far the best way to organize your whole monitoring and evaluation system. As I said, it's about this process of input, activity, output, outcome, and impact. That is the logic model. So let's think a little bit about the highest level, the impact statement at the top. So these are the actual or intended changes and generally capture changes in people's lives. When you write this, use a verb expressed in the past tense. So for example, use words like improved, strengthened, increased, reversed, or reduced. The idea is you are describing the end result. So it's a statement of what the end result will look like. And impacts are normally formulated to communicate substantial and direct changes over the longer period. So impact is that is produced beyond the end of the project or program life. So traditionally, the impact may not be fully realized for maybe 2 or 3 years after the project or program has completed. Looking at the other two, the output and outcome statements, again, when you write, use the same idea of a verb expressed in the past tense so that you are describing an end situation. So words like improved, strengthened, or increased are all the type of words that you will be using. So the outcome is the result of the project. So really we could say the outcome is what the project will have produced or done. When the project is complete, the outcome is the end result. Generally, we have one outcome statement, not a series of statements. So it's one statement that captures the overall outcome of your project. Having said that, some agencies do have multiple outcomes. The outputs, these are the things that you produce as a project or program. So as a result of the activities that you do, the output is that a result. So you do have control over the output. Traditionally, in a logical framework, we might have anything between, say, 2 and 9 outputs. So you would have maybe 2 to 9 outputs, 1 outcome statement, and 1 impact statement. Again, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, each of these statements will have indicators in the second column that explains how we are going to measure have we achieved each of our outputs or outcomes or impact. So here is an example of an output statement. For example, refugee children with disabilities have improved their Turkish language skills. Again, have a look at these later. We won't dwell on these statements now. Activities. These can be written in as an action. So they are the things that you will be doing in order to produce the outputs. So traditionally, when we write our logical framework, we would say output 1, and then for activities, we'd go 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Output 2, this is the output, and then the activities we'd label 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. So the idea is you number your activities as they build up to your output. So you can have a number of activities for each output. Beneath the activities, what you can do, and that goes beyond the logical framework, you can actually then go to tasks and subtasks. So what you can do as a monitoring and evaluation officer, once the logical framework is completed, is move from your activity logical framework statement and then subsequently work for each one, the tasks and the subtasks. Activities, we normally start with a verb, and we start these as actions, different from the outputs and outcome statements, which is written as the end result. The idea being that the activities are what we are going to do. If we do that, then we will achieve the outputs that we then stated. Inputs are those elements that you will be investing in the project. We normally put these in the box next to the activities. So we don't have indicators as such for the activity. Our indicator by default is the inputs. So when you complete your logical framework, the inputs can go in the box at the bottom of the indicator thing in the second column there. So the features of logical framework, it's result orientated, not activity driven. It sets out objectives and the causal relationships. It tells us whether objectives have been achieved by giving us the indicators. And it describes in the last column the external factors that influence the project's success. And we call this the assumptions. So the first column we can call the narrative column. Things that can happen here is be careful you don't make the narrative too long, too ambitious, or have multiple results. Try and be very specific. And you really want to be able to show the relationship between each. So in the narrative column, the if-then process is very important. And by that, I mean, if this output is achieved, then this outcome will happen as a result. So do make sure your logic is clearly stated. The last column is the assumptions and risks. So the good thing about the logical framework is we record the assumptions that are important. So assumptions are stated in positive terms, meaning they must happen. The thing to realize with the assumption, they are things beyond the control of the project. So these are things the project management will not be doing, but have to happen. From a monitoring perspective, very important because we need to ensure that the assumptions hold true. Slightly different to risks. Risks are negative statements, but in a logical framework, we refer to them as assumptions. So really it is the risk, but stated in a positive term, meaning it must happen. Again, if you've done a theory of change prior to the logical framework, you should be able to find those assumptions within the theory of change narrative that you have drawn out. So one thing to think about with assumptions is this flowchart here. So you could ask yourself, is the assumption important to success? If it's not, I mean, there's a limit to what we can include, then do not include a logical framework. But yes, if the assumption is important to our success, the next question we can ask, will it be realized? If it's very high and over 90%, don't include it because we can assume it will happen. The risk of it not happening is quite low. What's important is to be including those in the 50 to 90% range that we should be mentioning as an assumption because we're not 100% sure they will happen. Meaning, as a monitoring officer, we need to be checking that they do happen, otherwise our project will fail. If you have an assumption that is unlikely to happen, this is a dangerous situation, and if that happens, we must look at how we can redesign the project in order to influence the external factor. If we can't, then the project design is not feasible, and therefore we would have to redesign the project. If yes, redesign the project, add activities or results to reformulate the project purpose. So meaning if you've got an assumption in there which is unlikely to happen, but you can do something about it, then deal with it. This might mean bringing the assumption into the activities of your project itself. And we call those ones where the project will fail if left in a killer assumption. So be very careful you don't proceed with a project where there is assumption that needs to happen, but if it does not happen, the project would fail. That is a killer assumption. So we identify risks the same way as assumptions, and really these are the mirror opposite to them. So the risk is a negative statement, and then we turn that into the assumption, which becomes the positive statement. So the kind of situation you want to get yourself into is really think about these assumptions. Some of the things you want to think about, remember the assumed condition is outside control of the action you have. The assumed condition is necessary for project success. The assumed condition is not a result that could be included in the results framework, i.e. you're not controlling it. There is a high probability that the assumption will hold true. The assumption is specific and verifiable. The assumption is stated as if it is actually the case. The risk is clearly beyond the control of the action. The risk is not simply the negative restating of an assumption. The consequences of the risk are sufficiently grave as to pose a serious threat to overall action's success. There is a moderate to high probability that the risk may occur. So here is our logical framework again, the matrix. I'm not in this session going to talk around the indicators and means of verification. We do have separate sessions in this course around indicators and means of verification, which is the data collection process. I wanted to point out, though, that you do put into the logical framework the indicators at each level. So you actually document them inside the logical framework here. And likewise, in the column where it says means of verification, that is where you document and write the data collection or the evidence you will be seeking for each indicator. And the last column is where you document your assumptions and risks. Here is an example. I'm not going to read it all here, and you can come back to it, but just showing you what it tends to look like. This is a rather simplified one. but you can see. A couple of things you might say that I mentioned earlier. Can you see how for the output 1, I've numbered activities 1.1, 1.2. That means anything with a 1 relates to output 1. And we would do the same for output 2, output 3. This one has got 3 outputs, 1 purpose, 1 goal. So here is a case where they have used a different term for outcome and used the term purpose, and they've used the term goal instead of impact. Again, some agencies do that. Second column has the indicators. Third column means of verification, and the fourth column the assumptions. You do not need to put numbers into the first column, into the narrative summary. The numbers can go into the indicator section. Again, there are variants of the logical framework. Here is one where they have been more specific around the indicators. So what they have done in this one, you state the indicator, but you actually put in the green section your targets, so that you have your indicators stated, but then you put in baseline, what is your target, milestone 1, milestone 2, and then the target at the end. So it's sort of taking a logical framework a little bit deeper and showing how targets will be met over a period of time. So I find this is quite a useful one. This one, as you can see, marked there as DFID, is a format that the British use, DFID. So in that brief introduction, I hope I've given you a bit of an overview of the logical framework. A few general points I would make. Do not try and do the logical framework on your own. I have found this is best done in a group situation. Get as many of your stakeholders together and allow plenty of time to do this. And I also find that, say you do it today and then you finish at the end of the day, don't necessarily think that is the end. Reconvene tomorrow. And overnight, you often find people have had a think and they begin to think maybe our narrative summary is not correct. We need to change it and get our logic and so on. So we find that the logical framework goes through many different stages. If you have done the theory of change first, then it becomes a lot easier to do the logical framework, because really what you're doing with the logical framework is taking from the theory of change what is your results pathway. So what you need to do is create the results pathway in the theory of change and then articulate that in the first column of the logical framework. You can then build the indicators and the means of verification. The assumptions should appear on your theory of change as those things that will and should happen that are not going to be under your direct control of the process. Another useful tool to help you with the logical framework and before you start it is a problem tree. You can do a problem tree and then turn that into an objectives tree. Again, there's a short video explaining around the problem and objectives tree that you might find useful. So another good place to start. So I'd like to end by saying that you do need to have a logical framework in place for your project or program. Remember that if you've done this at the planning stage, you should revisit it on day one of the project, because maybe things have changed since you did the planning. So once you start your project, you probably want to have a look at that logical framework and possibly update it. Likewise, when you do the mid-term review or the mid-term evaluation, that's also a good opportunity to re-evaluate the logical framework. For us working in monitoring and evaluation, the logical framework should be something that we are really working on and really understand for our project or program. And it's something that the project team will expect you as the monitoring individual to be very wary of and working with. So have a go at creating a logical framework if you have not already done so. If you want any help or get a bit stuck with this or not clear on anything I have said, please do contact me. But also have a look at the short video I made. It only takes about 4 minutes, but that also summarizes quite clearly the logical framework approach and the examples as well that I have included within this course. Thank you very much.